Alright guys, topic 3.9, the Constitution. Let's get into it. Our guiding question is, what were the characteristics and functions of government that resulted from the ratification of the Constitution? Now, this topic, guys, we're not going to go into like super detailed descriptions of the Constitution. Rather, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a zoomed out look at the major features of the new government set up by the Constitution. So we're not going to get into every last little detail. After all, you take a class called Government where you spend an entire semester doing this. So we're just going to go over the highlights. Now, as a review, we had a branch that had been purposely left out of the Articles of Confederation, and that branch, of course, was the executive branch. There had not been a president under the Articles of Confederation. So we need to now look at this new government and how it's established, and guess what? The executive branch is there. So there'll be three of these branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. And power would be, certain powers would be given to each branch, and there would also be checks on those powers. Now, this is not an idea that the American Founding Fathers came up with. This is an idea they drew on from the Enlightenment. The Baron Montesquieu, a French philosopher, was the one who wrote about this idea of separation of powers very eloquently. Something else we see in this new Constitution, guys, is a system known as federalism. Federalism is this idea that political power should be shared. So rather than having an overpowering national government or overpowering state governments, you have certain responsibilities from both sides. So states can do certain things, the national government can do certain things, and there are certain things that they can both do. That's the shared power on our little Venn diagram. For example, only the national government can declare war. Tennessee can't declare war. Tennessee can't print its own money. But on the flip side, states are allowed to establish their own schools. This is why every state has different standards when it comes to education. Only a state can do things like issue marriage and driver's license. This is why there's not a one-size-fits-all driver's license for all 50 states. Only the states can ratify amendments to the Constitution. The national government cannot do that. Now, in the Bill of Rights, of course, there are 10 amendments. And the 10th Amendment is an interesting one because it's also known as the States' Rights Amendment. It's not one of those famous ones like freedom of speech or freedom to bear arms or whatever, but it's very, very important because what it says is that all rights should be reserved to the states or the people that are not in the Constitution or prohibited by it. In other words, if it's not mentioned in the Constitution as something that the federal government can do or cannot do, then that power should be in the hands of the individual states. So this is again, one of those things that was kind of a bone thrown to the anti-federalists to say, don't worry, the states are not going to be weakened to the point that they're not going to exist anymore. They still have a lot of power. Now, many people in the modern day believe that the federal government's gotten way too strong and way too powerful, and that the 10th Amendment is something that is not very well respected. That maybe there are certain things that should, in fact, be done by states, not the federal government. All right, the Bill of Rights. We just talked about the 10th Amendment at the very bottom there. This is going to be adopted in 1791. Remember, its purpose was to get the Constitution ratified by assuring people, yes, if you vote for this new Constitution, don't worry, we will put a Bill of Rights in it. And by the way, we didn't come up with this idea of a Bill of Rights. The English had had a Bill of Rights since the late 1600s. Now, some of these amendments, of course, are super famous. The First Amendment comes to mind. The Second Amendment is always in the news. And then some of them have been largely kind of forgotten. Like the Third Amendment is one of those, you're like, what's the point, right? You don't worry about federal soldiers showing up at your house and deciding to move in, right? That's not something you think about. But it was clearly something that our founding fathers were thinking about because they put it number 3, way ahead of other things like the Fifth Amendment, which protects against double jeopardy and protects you against self-incrimination. They thought it was more important than cruel and unusual punishments. I mean, think about that. This is third. That's down here. I think that's pretty interesting. All right, so Generally speaking, guys, those are the protections that the Bill of Rights have. These are things that are so commonplace to us, they're so ingrained in us, we kind of take them for granted oftentimes, and we kind of assume this has always been this way. Trust me, if you look at history, these rights were not enjoyed by most people throughout most of history. All right, let's get into that new branch, the executive branch. It's called the executive branch because they execute the law. In other words, they carry out the law. The legislative branch creates the law, but the executive branch carries them out. They execute them. So this executive branch would have a person in charge. We call him a president, or her a president one day. This would be a 4-year term appointment. There was no term limits originally. That will not come until the 20th century. The president has wide powers. He or she can make appointments to domestic offices, including, and the one that's always in the news when this happens, federal judgeships, including appointments to the Supreme Court. The president can veto the legislature. That veto can be overridden, but it's pretty rare. The commander-in-chief is the president, but the commander-in-chief cannot declare war. So every single person in our military, guys, from the lowest soldier to the highest general or admiral, they all answer to one person, and that's the commander-in-chief. Our founding fathers believed that a civilian should have final say on what the military does. And if you look at a lot of countries where the military becomes political and they take over, we should be thanking our lucky stars that's the way it is. Our military has never once seized control. But if you look at places like Africa and Asia and even Europe and South America, they have this happen all the time. So our president will be elected through a process known as the Electoral College. And the Electoral College was designed as kind of a buffer between the people and the presidency. In other words, as it was originally envisioned, when you went to go vote for the president, you would vote for an elector. An elector, it would be somebody from the community who's kind of upstanding and someone people trust, and then that person would go and cast his or her ballot for the president. So you basically, the original way the Electoral College worked is you would vote for somebody you trusted to choose a good president. So it was kind of like voting indirectly for president. Now, because bigger states had more representation, they would have more votes, and therefore states that have big populations are always key places for elections, right? I mean, think about California. They have 55 electoral votes. If you win all 55 of those votes, you're winning pretty much all the rest of this area in the country, right? All these states combined won't even equal one California. Now, the original idea was that there may not be candidates who would get a majority of the electoral votes. They would not get 50% plus 51% rather of the electoral votes. And in that case, what would happen is this would be sent to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, each state would get a single vote, and then they would decide who the next president would be. This has only happened a couple of times, and neither of those times happened any time recently. Because now we have a two-party system where it's almost guaranteed one of those two are going to get a majority of the electoral votes. All right, legislative branch time, guys. So the legislative branch, of course, is going to be made up of two houses. We talked about this in the last video. The House of Representatives is based on state population. They are elected directly by the people. House reps serve for 2-year terms. And what they do is they work with the Senate to pass bills. Bills are prospective laws. They also have the power to impeach the president and other federal appointees, like federal judges and members of the cabinet. The Senate is the second house of the Congress, the upper house it's sometimes referred to. There are only 2 senators per state, so that obviously the number of senators has varied throughout American history. Currently, we have 100. They are elected by the state legislatures. Originally they were. Now they're elected directly by the people. Senators serve for 6-year terms. They work with the House to pass those bills, and they have the power to convict the president and those federal judges. So the House would impeach a federal official. The Senate would put them on trial and convict or acquit the person for those crimes. We have had 3 impeachments in American history, Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, and all 3 times the Senate has not convicted them. None of those times has the Senate actually voted to remove the president from office. Quick note, while we do have presidential term limits now, there are still no term limits for House reps or for the Senate, and some of these people have been in there for literally decades. All right, final branch, judicial time. So the judicial branch got probably the least amount of specificity in the Constitution. For example, while the Constitution does mention setting up some sort of Supreme Court, you see the words down here, it didn't really lay out what that Supreme Court would look like, how it would function, what its jobs were necessarily. And so it wasn't until the Judiciary Act of 1789 was passed, which is separate from the Constitution, that the Supreme Court as we know it got going. It also established something called the Office of the Attorney General. The Attorney General is kind of like our chief law enforcement agent. He or she oversees basically prosecuting laws across the country. All right, guys, that is it for the Constitution. I know there's a super quick video, super quick overview. Obviously, we could delve way, way deeper into all this stuff, but I don't think that's necessary to do because we will go through some of these other things as the year progresses.